Hello, my name is Dr. Nathan Hudson, and I am the director of the Forage Flourish Contemporary Music Festival, and by extension, the Forage Flourish Community Music Project. Let me just tell you a little bit about what we are. So the Community Music Project is a series of 5 videos, each featuring a brand new piece of music, which you, the community, with or without any musical experience, are able to learn, engage with, and perform and share on a social media platform. The Forage Flourish Community Music Project is presented with support from Fulton County through their Virtual Arts Initiative grant, as well as the City of Alpharetta. Now, the 5 pieces which are being featured in these episodes are 3 by myself, and then a brand new piece by Dr. Alex Temple, as well as a brand new piece by Kevin Day. So today, I'm so excited to have you join me for episode 2 of the Community Music Project, where I will be introducing, explaining, and going over my brand new piece, Float. Before we get started learning about Float, I want to read to you the program note, and much like episode 1, speaking is hard, so I'm going to read off the paper. Float, subtitled A Lullaby, is a time for reflection, a time to rest and to take a step away. Even with the ebbing of the waves of the clouds, we will return to where we started. We are inevitably a part of the water, but that does not define us. It merely gives us a chance to float. Let's start taking a look at Float. The first thing you'll notice if you're looking at a score, which again, you can find through a link either in the body of this YouTube video or all across our social media platforms, is that it says we have to use our voice, your voice, through singing, humming, maybe a combination of the two. That's how we're going to make our music. Now, let's think about episode 1, okay? Where we talked about again and again and once again. We constructed a found marimba, we hit it with some objects, and while these sounds were relatively organized from low to high, there were not specific pitches that we were trying to attain. Well, in Float, there are also not specific pitches that we're going for, but we do have to engage with pitch. And so it's important that we can understand the concepts of how sound and how pitch work just a little bit so we can make some informed decisions. So let's take a step back. Let's talk about pitch. It's the frequency that waves are vibrating, right? Everything around us is in motion, always. And when it comes to pitch, this motion is audible. So, what's a pitch? It's the frequency of vibration of a wave. Science stuff. The slower the frequency, the lower the pitch. The faster the frequency, the higher the pitch. This is going to cover all the way from sounds we can't hear way down low to sounds we can't hear way up high, but your dog probably can. When we're thinking about how to organize these pitches, we're going to be drawing from the traditions of 18th century European music. I specify that because almost every culture in the world has their own way of engaging with pitches and collections of sounds, and this is just one of the options. So there's a series of 7 note names: A, B, C, D, E, F, and G, that correspond with the first 7 letters of the alphabet, which we're going to be using as kind of, markers or set frequencies of this kind of big spectrum that then repeats on itself to give us more defined sounds throughout low to high. These 7 note names, or 7 pitches, correspond with the white keys on a piano. Let's take a look at a diagram. Great. So I have 7 note names. They correspond with the white keys on a piano, and they repeat all the way up. But I see we have black keys as well. You're absolutely right. In between every repetition of these 7 pitches, they can actually be broken down into 12 notes. 12 half steps, we call them. That's going to be one of the smaller units that we use to identify pitch. Now, how we attain these black key notes on the keyboard is by altering one of our initial 7, A, B, C, D, E, F, or G, with an accidental, a sharp, which can slightly raise that pitch, or a flat, which can slightly lower that pitch. Now again, it's completely fluid if we think about the science with the frequency of these waves. It's completely fluid from the low end of the audible and the inaudible spectrum all the way up. But for our purposes, we did have to sort of find a way to make them consistent. And so musicians and thinkers back in the day did that. And they constructed what we call the chromatic scale. Let's take a listen. And then that would repeat all the way up, so that's how we can account for those black keys on the piano. So within this collection of pitches, musicians and thinkers and scholars, they began to want to make certain constructs of them that were pleasing or that fulfilled certain roles. One such construct is called a scale. It's going to be a collection of these half steps, maybe whole steps, which is just 2 half steps, and it's in a pattern that repeats, much like our initial 7 note names, A, B, C, D, E, F, G. A scale is going to be 7 notes, but they might be altered. They might have a sharp or a flat thrown in there, and they also repeat. Let's take a listen to a scale. One thing you might have noticed is that I repeated one pitch 3 times. In this case, it was a C. The idea and the construction of a scale centers around and necessitates the need for a tonic pitch, or kind of a pitch that has a strong gravitational pull. The other notes of a scale want to get back there. And it's this kind of need for closure, if you will, need to return to that tonic that helps to give direction into music. This, of course, only applies to the kind of music that we're specifically talking about, which draws influences from that 18th century European tradition. So many cultures around the world have their own ways of creating meaning of pitches and how they can craft something that matters, that has intention. This is just one way to go about it. So, when it comes to these pitches and these scales, we need to kind of go one step further with how we're thinking about them. For our purposes in float, I want to mention 2 words to you, 2 musical ideas: major and minor. Major and minor are subjective as we think about float. Now, if you were in music school or something like that, perhaps somebody might tell you, well, no, they're not subjective. There's a certain order of things that we do to create something that's major or minor. And while they would be correct in that context, it's a bit more fluid for us, but we got to talk about it. If we listen to the electronic track for float, yes, there's an electronic track that accompanies your performance, and you can find that as a link in this YouTube video or on our Facebook page. You will hear 2 pitches, C and G. Now, they're going to sound maybe a little bit different because they are synthesized sounds, but we're going to hear those 2 pitches. Those 2 pitches are important because they kind of frame what could potentially be major or minor. And the difference between the 2 is just 1 half step, 1 adjacent key on the keyboard. Let's take a listen to a major chord. a construction of pitches that creates a triad. We call it a chord. But let's listen to a major chord. If I change 1/2 step, here's a minor chord. It's a whole different aesthetic. But both of those constructions, both of those chords had C and G. This is important because due to the nature of float, we can kind of freely explore between the two as we see fit, but we need to be aware of them. Now, I mentioned that major and minor are subjective in float, and the feeling or the aesthetic or the sensation that they create is different. Let's listen to a passage in a major key. That passage was simple, major tonality. Again, if I change one note, I can put it into a minor world. Let's take a listen. It sounds a lot different. Major will generally be hopeful, pushing forward. Minor is going to be a little bit more mournful, if you will, maybe a little more down. However, that's not always the case. And there's a ton of beauty in minor, and there's a ton of sadness in major, and they can kind of intermingle and mix themselves together. But it's important that we can hear that distinction. As we start to look at float and how to perform it, we need to be aware of this idea of major and minor, because you're going to have to experiment to find what sort of tonal world you want to be in. Are you trying to be more on the major side? Or the minor? Or both? That's up to you. But you have to experiment and be aware that both exist. There's also a chance you might not do either. It might just be a little more free with how we think about the pitches we create in float. And that's also fantastic. This is just a way for those who might not have as much musical experience to build a little bit of framework to help you inform your decisions in float. One thing relating to science that I do want to mention here is that as you begin to experiment and you hear yourself sing against this electronic accompaniment, some pitches might be off-putting. Some combinations might be extremely pleasing. This is of course subjective, but also it's important to check in with the science here. With these waves that are moving, sometimes when they mingle with other waves, they don't exactly agree. And we can create some abrasive sounds. That's because the waves are competing. So just to be aware of that, and that's a pretty cool tidbit to kind of tie this all in together with our initial discussion on pitch. I like to think about it this way. Have you ever made a pizza? Some people love pineapple on pizza. Some people hate pineapple on pizza, but it's an option. Major, minor, dissonant, consonant, all these things, that's up to you, but they do all exist. So let's do a little bit of experimenting so I can show you some of these things I mean. I'm going to play this interval that we hear in the electronic track for float, which is a perfect fifth, we call it. C and G. I mentioned those pitches earlier, but we do have a name for it, a perfect fifth. A fifth because they are 5 alphabet letter names away. And perfect because it's just so pristine. I'm going to sing some notes over it, and you can listen and hear how these waves are interacting. Maybe this will give you a starting place for when you begin to engage with float and interpret it yourself. It's a great exercise for you to do at home if you can get access to a piano, or just throw on this electronic accompaniment track and practice this yourself. Let yourself be free. Experiment. Make some discoveries. As we start to look at the sheet music for float, I would be remiss if I did not mention an extremely strong influence on this work. So this electronic accompaniment track serves as sort of a drone, okay? Now drones are common in a ton of musical traditions. One that I particularly drew from is from the Indian classical music tradition. And in this case, I approached this drone similar to a tanpura that kind of creates a harmonic bass for one type of Indian classical music. There's a great YouTube channel that is run by Anuja Kamat, which I would highly recommend, where she goes into a ton of fantastic detail and demonstrates a whole bunch about Indian classical music. Even though the sound world we're creating in Float is different than Indian classical music, they share a lot of similarities with their approach, and I think that checking out some of her videos would be really, really beneficial. Let's dive in. Again, as I mentioned, there is an electronic accompaniment track for Float, which you can find in the body of this YouTube video or on our social media. This piece uses a graphic notation style, okay? As compared to Again and Again and Once Again, which had rhythms on a staff. We still see a staff, but there's no note heads, there's no rhythms. We see straight lines, and we see lines that connect them. This kind of style is meant to give you, the performer, a ton of freedom. But it's freedom within a framework. At the beginning of Float, you will hear the electronic track drone for 5 to 10 seconds, or about the time that you think, I should probably start singing. At that point, you have to decide your first pitch. There's a lot of options. You decide your first pitch, and that's going to sort of give us a guiding point as we work through the rest of the piece. I've mentioned that we have to use our voice, singing or humming. If you are singing, the syllable or the sound you want to make is up to you. You can go ooh, ah, ee, oh, All these things are fair game. Make some decisions, experiment. You'll find one that maybe is easier for you to create. Go with that one. Perhaps even add a word. Make it personal. Now here's how we're going to interpret these lines. If you see a straight line, you will sustain whatever pitch you're on. For a connecting line in between two straight lines, we're going to sort of slide between them, like this. Let's say here were our two pitches. If you didn't see the line that was connecting them, you would sing them separately. And you're probably noticing that I'm using my hand as I'm doing this. It's a great way to practice. The kinesthetic side of music making and music learning can be really beneficial, especially for a graphic score like this. We can actually draw the shape of the music just to help keep us inside of this framework, or to help show us when we intentionally go out of it. You will notice that we do have some dynamic markings underneath each line of music, and these lines are numbered 1 through 6 on the left-hand side. We don't have any bar lines, there's no measures, there's just 6 lines of music. Here's how we're going to perform it. After the electronic track starts, and you wait those few seconds and you begin, you will sing or hum the first line of music. You can go as fast or as slow as you would like. But you do need to follow the dynamic markings. As you complete the first line of music, lines 2, 3, 4, and 5 can be performed in any order. You decide. So take a pen or a highlighter or a Sharpie and mark it up and decide your order. Once you sing through those 4 lines of music, you then are able to go back and repeat them as you wish. Maybe you're singing them really quickly and you have time to repeat 2 or 3 of them. Maybe you can just do 1. Maybe you can't do any. Towards the end of the accompaniment, you'll hear a low note enter. It kind of sounds like the ground is opening up. When you hear this, this is going to roughly signal when you need to start line 6. Then you will sing through line 6, and when you are done making your sound with your contribution into the piece, you can wait and the electronic track will finish. It shouldn't be more than 5 to 10 seconds. This freedom of the graphic notation allows us to sort of break free of the bonds of those chromatic notes I mentioned earlier, all the scales, all that stuff, because we can kind of slide between them. But we need to be aware, and we need to be aware of that tonic, which in this case is C. Okay, we need to be aware of that pitch as we are freely exploring these shapes. If anything goes, nothing matters. Sometimes. Let's say you are a slightly more advanced musician. Feel free to add embellishments. Maybe this is a grace note. Maybe you do a rapid repetition of one of the gestures, one of the shapes. Maybe you even want to try it on an instrument. Wouldn't that be exciting? If you are performing with a group, I have a couple options. The first is that you each all start at the beginning, okay? And you kind of perform the work as one cluster of sounds. Now you still need to all be performing lines 2, 3, 4, and 5 in the same order, but you're all just making your own sounds, making this kind of modular group of pitches that's going through the work. The other option is to stagger your entrances by a few seconds. It'll create sort of what we call a canon. Think about row, row, row your boat. Right? You're each doing the same piece, but starting just a few seconds later, and of course, with your own ideas about pitch and where to start. If you want to engage young children, I have a couple ideas. The first is to have them make a whooshing sound, imitating air or waves maybe, and have them get louder or softer, perhaps as you get higher or lower. That can be really neat. The second idea is to have them not make any sound at all, but just to follow the shape of what you're doing or what your group is doing with their hands, maybe with their body. It creates almost a dance element. But the biggest thing as we think about trying to incorporate young children in float is we need them to build awareness of shapes, right? High, low, loud, soft, and how they can either create a sound that goes with it or they can feel that sound physically with their body. If you want to get really wild with them, perhaps even give them a pencil and say, hey, add some new lines into the music. Wouldn't that be something? Throughout everything you do, though, as you begin to engage with float and you practice and you make some decisions about your pitches, all these things, have fun, experiment, make noise, right? Now, maybe you'll get some complaints from a neighbor, a coworker, a family member, a roommate, but encourage them to join in as humans using our voice. We all have a voice. We all have the power to say something. We can do something. And in this case, let that be what creates music. In these days that we've been home, making memories is really important. This is a great way to do that. Creating something by hitting it with a spoon, like we did in episode 1 with again and again and once again, is fantastic. But it is different, and it means something different when we create it with the voice that we have, that's ours. Thank you all so much for joining me for episode 2 of the Community Music Project, where we learned about my brand new piece, Float, and about how you can engage with it, perform it, and make something really special. Share your performance on our Facebook page at FF Community Music Project. Find us on there, give us a follow if you haven't. And this video will be available on YouTube as well as on that Facebook page, and links to the score and the accompaniment track will be found therein as well. Go out there, make some decisions, make some mistakes, make some beautiful noise, and we'll see you at the next one.
you.